My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to discuss what it means to be an elf friend. This is a topic that doesn't get a whole lot of discussion because there's really not a lot to go on, but I was listening to the Tolkien professor talk about where the hobbits meet Tom Bombadil and Goldberry, and Goldberry mentions that Frodo is an elf friend, and I'll come back to that obviously when we get there, but the way he was talking about it made me think about it a little more deeply, and so I decided to try and find all the references I could to this idea and see what we can come up with in terms of what this means, what it implies, and what we can gather from it. So let's take a look. So the first reference we get to anybody being an elf friend in any of Tolkien's published works, at least that I'm aware of, is actually in The Hobbit. Near the end of The Hobbit, Bilbo is about to leave for home, and he is traveling with Gandalf and Thranduil, the king of the Woodland Elves, away from the Lonely Mountain, and he gives the Elven King a gift, specifically kind of to make up for the fact that he had to burgle his living while hiding out in his halls. And the Elven King asks him why he's giving it to him. How have I earned such a gift? And he makes it clear, well, I kind of stole from you a lot. I owe you something. And the Elven King, in thanking him for it, says, I name you elf friend and blessed. And that's about all we get. The next real reference we get to anybody being an elf friend then comes in The Lord of the Rings, and specifically in the Fellowship of the Ring, when Frodo is moving through the Shire and meets Gildor and Glorian and the wandering company of elves that scare off the Black Rider the second time they encounter him. By the way, if you don't know what this episode is all about because you've only ever seen the movies, I did do a video on this, which I will link to in the description below so you can get an idea of the context if you're interested. At any rate, in the conversation that he has with Gildor, he's trying to figure out more about the Black Rider, see if Gildor knows anything. Gildor seems to know something, but he doesn't really want to scare Frodo with what he knows. And he's also reluctant to give him advice because Frodo can't really tell him much about his own mission. He's like, I don't know what to do, man. If you won't tell me more, I'm not sure I can help you more. And eventually, Gildor does kind of give him a piece of advice and say that I'm not doing this because I want to. I'm doing it because you asked. And he also follows up by saying, we'll also spread the word around to the other wandering companies of elves that you're about and you may need help. And he says, I name you elf friend, and may the stars shine upon the end of your road. And that's about all we get out of that, too. We don't get any more detail on what that means. Now we come to the Goldberry moment, and here the hobbits have been brought to the home of Tom Bombadil, and when they enter, Frodo sees Goldberry, and he kind of spontaneously spouts poetry in the style of Tom Bombadil, and ends up, surprising himself in the process. He's kind of shocked at himself saying such things, and Goldberry then says, I had not heard that the folk of the Shire were so sweet-tongued, but I see that you are an elf friend. The light in your eyes and the ring in your voice tells it. This is really interesting because this tells us something about elf friends that we didn't know before because we didn't get any real information before. There's this idea that being an elf friend is not just, I'm the friend of elves. It also implies some outward thing that other people can see or perceive, and especially people like Goldberry who are, more than mortal. They can see or know things about you that you yourself may not quite know. And similar to this, much later in the story, when Frodo and Sam are talking with Faramir, Faramir will tell Frodo that he has something strange about him, maybe an elvish air. This may be a reference to that same idea, although it's not as clear. But Faramir, to the extent that a mortal man is going to notice these things, it would make sense that he would, because we can definitely tell from the story that Faramir is one of the most perceptive individuals, and he is nearly purely Númenorian, and in that respect, closer to the elves than many other men would be. So at any rate, we get this reference from Goldberry, the light in your eyes and the ring in your voice tell it. Now, the other aspect of this, where she says, I did not know that folk of the Shire were so sweet-tongued. That's a little ambiguous because is she saying that elf friends are, by virtue of being elf friends, more likely to spout poetry? Or is she saying that the kind of person that ends up becoming an elf friend is the kind of person who would end up spouting poetry? It's really hard to say. It's also a little tricky because we know that Frodo spouts poetry before he ever meets Gildor. He does a variation on the Bilbo Roads Go Ever On and On poem, pretty close to setting out on the trip. And so you can put that down to maybe him just remembering enough of Bilbo's and not being poetic himself per se, although it seems like he is kind of being poetic because he isn't even really sure if it's one of Bilbo's. It may just be deeply embedded in his memory somewhere. But the other thing is, when Frodo talks to Goldberry in verse, he does it in a Tom Bombadil style verse. It's very much Tom Bombadil's style of rhyming and poetry. So, on balance, hard to say whether that implies anything or not. It may be that he's just kind of picked up something from Tom Bombadil. Who knows? But at any rate, certainly there is something outward about him that some people can pick up on and notice that person is an elf friend. And so you get the idea, going back to the Gildor and Glorian moment, that when Gildor names him an elf friend, it's doing something specifically that will make him recognizable by other people. It's not just, I'm just being nice to you. You're considered a friend of elves now because you're a good guy. So there's that. One final comment that could be added here is when Éomer first meets Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, at one point Éomer says that there's something strange about Aragorn, and he kind of connects it with some of the things about him. It's not just his name, it's not just his clothes, there's something strange about him. Could that be because Aragorn himself is an elf friend, which we have to assume he is? I mean, he was raised by Elrond. Speaking of which, and the reason why I think this works, the last real reference that we get to elf friends that I know of is in the Council of Elrond. And after Frodo basically steps up and volunteers to take the ring to Mordor, Elrond tells him, if all the mighty of the elf friends of old, Húrin, Túrin, Hador, and Beren himself, were gathered together, your seat should be among them. Now, all these individuals we know of from the Silmarillion, and they're all pretty big deals in the Silmarillion. Hador was one of the ones who was most devoted to service of the elves in the Silmarillion. Húrin, of course, was a great hero in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Túrin, it's kind of interesting that he gets labeled an elf friend considering he leads to the destruction of Nargothrond, but he also is fostered by an elf king, Elu Thingol, and so in that respect, you can see the connection with Aragorn. Túrin is an elf friend because he is taken in by the elves and treated more or less as one of their own. Same with Aragorn. And then, of course, Beren. Beren is and that's why Elrond puts him last and says, an even Beren. Beren is kind of like the elf friend par excellence. He is the main person you could consider an elf friend, which is also kind of also weird because early in the story, of course, Beren is not liked by Thingol at all. At any rate, these are the only other people we know of that really get called elf friends. And so we get this idea that there's something unique about all these people. What is it that's unique about them? Certainly, elf friendliness does not guarantee success, or Túrin would have been a much less tragic character, let's say. But we do get the idea that all of these individuals overachieved relative to their human counterparts. And we certainly get the same thing with Frodo. He goes above and beyond anything that anybody expected, although to a certain extent that's because of his own hobbit nature. The tricky part is, what really does being an elf friend mean? So I think one thing we can say is that when you are named an elf friend, as I mentioned earlier, it at least makes you recognizable to other people. Specifically, we have to assume recognizable by other elves. And it also makes him recognizable as an elf friend to Goldberry, who is not an elf, but is presumably at least a Maya. And so, would be if anything, more likely to notice such things. Elrond, of course, never may, well, I mean, he may be told the story of Gildor off screen, so to speak, but as far as we know, he's never told directly that Frodo's been named an elf friend, and yet he seems to assume that he is. And that seems appropriate given what Frodo has just volunteered to do. He's putting his own safety on the line for the sake of all Middle Earth, which is something that the elves care deeply about, even though they do have their, their sadness with Middle Earth. They do love it. So there's this idea that you can be at least recognized as an elf friend by other people. Beyond that, again, going back to what Goldberry says about him being sweet-tongued, that part is ambiguous. Does it change him in a way that changes his own behavior? It's really hard to tell. After this point, we don't really see him spouting all that much more poetry in any of the rest of the story. We do see him change over the course of the story, but it's hard to tell if that's just because of the events or something else. Certainly, Frodo seems wiser than many of his companions, but that seems kind of to have been the case all along, and he's also the oldest of the four hobbits. So it's not really clear what exactly being an elf friend does to you. Nevertheless, it seems clear that it definitely does something to you. It changes something about you. The fact that he has a light in his eyes and a ring in his voice, to me, that signifies that any change that has come to him is a spiritual change. It is not a physical change. It is not, he is now just kind of magically, got an aura about him. It's something about his person, something about him as an individual has changed. What that is, it's really hard to pin down because of the nature of the story. But again, going back to those references of the other mighty elf friends that Elrond talked about, it looks like all of the people who are elf friends end up being really, really overachievers in comparison to other people. Turin, even who, a lot of what he did ended in disaster, he was still an overachiever in a lot of ways. And so I think, and another element of this too is going back to Bilbo's being named elf friend and blessed. One of the things that we know about Bilbo is that he definitely does live a blessed life. He lives a long time, which you could put down to the ring, but you can also see, his long-lived ancestry as well. But more importantly, what is the one thing that Bilbo does that no other hobbit ever did, according to Gandalf? Gave up the ring willingly. Gandalf puts this down to the fact that he obtained the ring in an act of, associated with an act of mercy. He didn't kill Gollum. But I think we might also be able to connect this with the idea that he has been named an elf friend and blessed. Did this give him a little bit more spiritual fortitude that he wouldn't have otherwise had? I'm thinking so. And in this connection, too, it should be mentioned that in The Hobbit, when it talks about the wood elves for the first time, it says that they're, less wise than the elves in Rivendell and whatnot, but they're still elves, and that means good people. So there's this idea in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Certainly, if you look at the Silmarillion, you wouldn't necessarily get the same idea. But if you look at The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, elves, generally speaking, are just always good guys. And there's even a sense in which that's true in the Silmarillion, in the sense that they're always against the bad guy. But they often end up doing really terrible stuff anyway. But the idea there seems to be that elves, on the whole, are, good people. And so, in that sense, to be blessed and named a friend of the good people tends to imply that you're also one of the good people. And more than that, if you are blessed, it does seem to maybe imply that you're going to have a little bit more of that spiritual fortitude. Frodo makes it all the way to Mordor after suffering, multiple wounds, tortures, capture. I mean, you name it. The guy went through quite a lot to get all the way to Mordor and still managed to make it. Now, at the end, Sam has to be kind of the motivating force, but Frodo certainly is not quitting. He's relying on Sam to kind of push him through, but he's also not just despairing and laying down to die. And the fact that he got that far in the first place is also something. We also see Frodo acting in ways that are, like going back to Faramir's reference to him having an elvish air. He also says that Frodo spoke well in a hard place when he was interrogating him. So you do get the idea maybe that being an elf friend imparts something like wisdom, courage, aspects of being one of the good people that elves are. And so I think that's probably the most we can say on this topic. If anybody else has any other references that I've missed out or any other ideas for how this kind of plays out over the course of the story that can give us a little more insight, please do mention in the comments below. But this is about as far as I'm comfortable going. So I hope you enjoyed that video, and if you did, please do give it a like and share it around. Hopefully you can also come up with your own comments and we can have an interesting discussion there. And if you want to follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, I occasionally drop some interesting Tolkien trivia questions there. To subscribe to the channel, you can do that here. Don't forget to click the bell icon. You can support the channel over here, and 2 of my previous videos are up here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.